please. Thank you all.
Applause to you, first of all, dear National Constitution Center friends, for showing up at noon on February 13th because you are hungry for constitutional learning. It is wonderful to see a full house of learners and congregants of the Constitution, and we must welcome this very special and distinguished guest by reciting for him our congressional mission to inspire him and ourselves for the learning that is before us. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, the National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Wonderful. That was so beautiful to hear that. Isn't that inspiring?
Okay.
We are going to be doing lots of nonpartisan learning over the next couple of months, including, here are some highlights of the winter season over the next few weeks. March 4th, Intelligence Squared returns to the National Constitution Center for a live debate, which will be on NPR, about whether or not the platforms, Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, and Google, should and must respect First Amendment principles. On March 18th, we'll explore the complicated and highly contested relationship between academic freedom and free speech on college campuses with university leaders and scholars of all perspectives. And on March 27th, we'll discuss the hottest topic in constitutional battle right now, which is what happens when religious liberty collides with anti-discrimination laws. And that is going to be a great discussion as well. Friends, it is now my greatest pleasure to introduce one of America's most important political commentators, one of the sanest observers of the American scene, whose cool-eyed descriptions of American history and politics have cast so much light about our current vexations, and whose superb new book has taught me so much, and I know will teach you so much about a question we've discussed together here at the Constitution Center over the past couple of years, namely, what is the source of the polarization that is dividing America? Is it historically unusual or not, and what can be done about it? Michael Tomasky is special correspondent for the Daily Beast. He is the editor of the superb journal, which I recommend to you, Democracy, a Journal of Ideas. He's a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. He's the author of 5 books, including the most recent, If We Can Keep It, How the Republic Collapsed and How It Might Be Saved. Please join me in welcoming Michael Tomasky.
Hey. Thank you, Jeff, and thanks to you all. What a great crowd.
It is a great crowd.
Let's go.
Let's go. Come let us reason together, as Brandeis said. You argue in this superb book that political polarization is not new. Indeed, it dates back to the time of the founding, when the delegates to the convention clashed over the status of slavery. And you note that the Great Compromise over slavery passed by a single vote. Yes. And yet you say that something important has changed, which is that the parties, which arose in 1800, used to be cross-partisan. There were anti- and pro-slavery Whigs. There were anti- and pro-bank Democratic Republicans. But around the 1960s, you say, the parties began to be much more ideologically homogenous, and now we have red and blue America that is more ideologically sorted than at any time since the Civil War. Let's unpack all of those important points. Take us back to the time of the founding. Describe the status of political polarization in the Constitutional Convention and how the founders dealt with it.
Sure. Well, we were polarized at the beginning over essentially the same question that we're polarized over now. I mean, we're polarized over a lot of questions right now, but the central question is the size and scope and power of the federal government. That's what Democrats and Republicans fight about today. That's what Federalists and Anti-Federalists fought about at the time of the Constitutional Convention and the question of whether or not to ratify the convention. The Federalist Papers, as I'm sure all of you know, were papers that were written by the Federalists to persuade New Yorkers and others to vote for ratification. And at the same time, there were Anti-Federalists who were agitating in their pamphlets against ratification. And they didn't have to use their real names. It was sort of like Twitter. and and they could be brutal. This guy Brutus was particularly brutal in some of his writings. So the division is very old. Then when the Republic is formed, we have the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians, and their debates are so similar to the debates that we see today. The Hamiltonians, of course, were the city slickers, the swells, the coastal elites. The Jeffersonians were the backwoods people, the yeoman farmers, to use the often used phrase. And the Hamiltonians wanted a big, powerful federal government. And the Jeffersonians were suspicious of this, and they wanted no powers of taxation looming over them from, well, what was then Philadelphia, what became Washington. Now, to cover a lot of history pretty quickly, and then we can double back on whatever Jeff wants to double back on. But as Jeff said, the thing about our parties, the unusual thing about our parties, was that they were ideologically heterogeneous. They were hodgepodges. They didn't really make any coherent sense. This was quite in contrast to the parties of Europe. As the countries of Europe began to throw off monarchy and become democratic republics in the 19th century, they formed political parties too, after we had formed ours. But their political parties were, logical. They had a party of the left and a party of the right. England had the Liberal Party. Labour came later, of course, in the 1920s, but they had the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. And other countries had Christian Democrats versus Social Democrats. Some countries had more than two parties, of course, because they had different kinds of systems. But basically, two large parties, one of the right, one of the left. The United States of America never really had that because, in the first instance of slavery, and founders and the leaders of the next generation or two decided that rather than make slavery the political issue, that they just wanted to paper over it because they knew that dealing with it would be a crisis and would lead to what it indeed led to by the time we got to 1861. So Martin Van Buren is a very pivotal figure in this history. You may not have given him much thought, but he is a very pivotal figure in this history. He's actually the real father of the Democratic Party. After the 1824 election, Van Buren decided that he wanted to form a new national political party, uniting, in his phrase, the planters of the South with the plain Republicans of the North. So he wanted to do a national party that would, in the 1828 election, get behind Andrew Jackson and hope that Jackson would win the presidency. That's the birth of the modern Democratic Party, but it was notably not about slavery. So the party had pro-slavery forces and anti-slavery forces. The Whig Party had pro-slavery forces and anti-slavery forces. Go on through history, and the parties continue to be these strange amalgams that didn't really make any ideological sense. So the Republican Party of the late 19th century, by the time of the Industrial Revolution, the Republican Party chose sides in that Industrial Revolution and was the party of the capitalists. But as the country grew, and this is another important factor here, we had a country that grew, that added states, that added population, that added different political interests, which made us very different from the countries of Europe, because France was France in 1789, but we kept growing. So the Republican Party was the party of Wall Street and the party of the old abolitionists in the Great Lakes and up through upstate New York and into New England, and the party of agrarian populists. It didn't really make any sense. The Democratic Party, the same thing. The upside of all this, though, and I'll finish in a second, the upside of all this was that there was a lot of crossover. There was a subset in the middle where there were Democrats and Republicans bunched together, you see. And so this made compromise, in the era of compromise, I don't want to make any assumptions about this audience, but I can see that some of you were alive then.
All of us were alive then.
I was too.
Many of us still live then.
Yeah. Oh, don't I every day? No, I was alive too. I was just a kid being told this by my dad. But that's what made, for the era of compromise that many of us grew up in, that's what made it possible. There was this overlap in the parties. And so if you look at, for example, the roll call vote in Congress in 1965 on Medicare, nearly half of Republicans voted for Medicare in 1965, nearly half. Now, the right wing existed, hard right conservatives existed then, and they called it socialized medicine, and they were against it. And in fact, Ronald Reagan made a spoken word record album against the Medicare bill. But they were only part of the Republican Party then, and another part of the Republican Party came from these traditions that I discussed earlier. So anyway, there was overlap. And then, starting in the 60s with civil rights and heading into abortion, women's rights, gay rights, immigration, and economic stress, the parties hardened into two separate entities. And so we have no longer do we have any intra-party well, we have some, but not like we did in the historical sense.
That is a superb synthesis of the argument, and you've taken us to the point in the 60s when there was a 50% overlap in Congress between the most conservative Democrats and the most liberal Republicans to today when there is no overlap.
Right.
But let's go back to the 19th century on a few points before we try to figure out how things changed. Larry Kramer, the constitutional scholar, is also a big Van Buren fan. Yeah. And he says Van Buren's insight in creating the modern party was to organize it around constitutional ideals, namely that of states' rights and constrained federal government. Mm-hmm. And he says for most of American history, the parties were defined by their allegiance to Jeffersonian or Hamiltonian ideals, and that gave it a constitutional coherence that allowed the cross-cutting political exchanges to take place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. And Van Buren, Van Buren was a unique and different character. He was, by all accounts that I read, he was a very suave, polished gentleman. I wrote that if he were alive today, he's the kind of senator who'd be on Morning Joe twice a week. He was very smooth. He would have been welcome at Georgetown parties and so forth. But he stood out from the generation before him, certainly, in the sense that, as you'll recall, the Founding Fathers didn't want political parties. Washington, Jefferson, everybody warned against them. But Van Buren said, no, political parties are worthy associations where, men, he said men, of course, excuse me, men have differences of the highest character that were indeed about constitutional interpretation in the first instance. And we need associations to reflect these differences and to carry out the debate over them. And so he was a very important figure. And he was also the first, I'd say, Jeff, to express for the populace the idea that politics was a participatory ritual and was something that should be fun and that people could be involved in. It was a very different thing in those days. You know, and I'm sure many of you know, presidential candidates didn't campaign back then. They didn't even campaign really until Woodrow Wilson. So what was there for a citizen to do? Some things at the local level, but not much to give the citizen a sense of a national identity. And so I think that National Democratic Party that Van Buren created was the first party that gave citizens a kind of national identity.
And now let's talk about some of the structural decisions that Congress made that are so important today. One big one occurred in 1842 with the law that mandated single-member districts. And you said before that some states had ticket voting and others had single-member districts, and that has huge consequences for polarization. Tell us about that choice.
Yes. They didn't put anything in the Constitution about how we were to elect Congress. They said simply that, it will be up to the states. And there were a lot of decisions like that, of course, that they left to the states. Now, most states decided to use single-member districts simply because that's basically what had existed in most places. The House of Burgesses, for example, was a single-member district legislature. But every state didn't. Some states used what they then called general ticket voting, which meant, the Federalists put forward this slate and the Democratic Republicans put forward this slate, and whoever won the congressional seats in the state. Some states went kind of violently back and forth in the early days. This state, notably, Pennsylvania, used single-member districts for the first Congress. Then for the second one, they switched to general ticket voting. Then the third one, they switched back, and the fourth one, they switched back, because there was this big wrestling match even then between, the moneyed interests in Philadelphia and the rest of the state. And the rest of the state is really big, right? And in those days especially, it was like a massive place, and Pittsburgh was 1,000,000 miles away. So this went back and forth until 1842, and finally Congress decided, and this was mostly a Whig reform. The Whigs were in power then. You'll remember that William Henry Harrison won in 1840. He beat Van Buren, in fact, but then he died, and then John Tyler became the president. And John Tyler wasn't really much of a Whig. Why he was Harrison's vice presidential candidate, nobody really knows, but he was, and he became a Whig, and he had these huge fights with the Congressional Whig Party, and he vetoed a bank bill. They ran on the bank bill, and they had both houses of Congress. Imagine this happening today. Imagine cable news, how it would explode. They had both houses of Congress. They passed a bank bill. Tyler, their president, vetoed it. They listened to his objections. They went back and passed another one. He vetoed it again. And so then, without going into all the details of how this Reapportionment Act came about.
Sorry, why did he veto it? I have to ask.
It's in the book. I don't remember.
Sorry.
Okay.
I read it too, so it's my fault as well. But.
Another reason to buy it.
Yeah. To reread it.
But they finally passed a reapportionment bill that mandated single-member districts, but then some states didn't obey it, mostly southern states. And this is a very complicated thing that I don't know if I can describe shortly, but of course it had to do with slavery and votes in Congress over slavery questions. That the South thought that if they could vote with one voice, they would be stronger and represent their number more solidly. Then we went back and forth on single-member districts versus general ticket voting for a number of years, and general ticket or at-large voting wasn't actually made against the law until the late 1960s. Hawaii had at-large congressional districts until 1970. I say at the end of the book that I think it would be a good idea if we went back to some of this at-large or multi-member voting. I think it could reduce polarization around the edges. It's not going to fix anything, but I think it could reduce it around the edges if we elected some members of the House of Representatives from either larger multi-member districts. Say you had 3 of them in Pennsylvania, one from the eastern part of the state, one from the central part of the state, and one from the western part of the state. They couldn't be as aggressively gerrymandered as individual single-member districts could be, and they might make for the election of somewhat more moderate representatives. So that's the extent to which single-member districts have made polarization a little worse than it might be.
Another of your proposed reforms at the end, and one of the many virtues of this book, is that reforms are concrete and plausible, is expand the size of the House of Representatives. And you tie that to a very important constitutional point. Friends, you know that the First Amendment proposed in the original Bill of Rights was not the Free Speech Amendment, but one that would have required one representative in Congress for every 30,000 inhabitants. Michael does the math and shows that if that had passed, there would be about 9,000 people in Congress today. You can see the original amendment in the original Bill of Rights outside there. But Michael, tell us that history. What was the debate over what the proper size of Congress should be? How did they settle on the number they settled on? And why do you think it would be helpful to modestly expand the size of the House today?
They settled on the number they settled on in a pretty reasonable, orderly fashion. Everything they did in the building down the way doesn't quite fit that description, but this does. And they tossed some different numbers around, and they finally agreed on, I think, they changed it either from 40,000 to 30,000 on the last day, or from 30,000 to 40,000. I think it was 40 to 30. on the very last day. And, this one guy from Massachusetts was insistent on it, and everybody else was like, I just want to get home, okay. But they did, of course, include the provision that we would have a census every 10 years, and that when that census was done, the number of districts would grow. And this duly happened. Censuses were performed every 10 years, and the size of the House of Representatives grew every 10 years. But something didn't happen. They weren't drawn fairly at all. And over the course of the 19th century, what happened was, to put it simply and bluntly, that cities got screwed. And state legislatures, which mostly were not in cities, right? This is another compromise that dates to the early days of our republic. State capitals weren't the big cities. State capitals were chosen, they were central cities like Harrisburg that people could get to from this end of the state and the other end of the state. I mean, think about them all. Hartford, Connecticut, Trenton, New Jersey, Columbia, South Carolina. They're all in the middle of the state. In fact, in France, they went so far when they had the revolution and they did away with the old provinces of the Ancien Regime and made the new départements. They made them really small, and they had a rule that the capital of the département could be no more than one day's carriage ride away from any point in that department. So that too was another compromise and another factor that, just the question of size. They debated the size of the states and the population and how that was going to work out. It's really interesting to burrow into all these things. But basically, what was your question?
Why should the House be bigger now?
Yeah, right. Thank you. Yeah, I got.
Which is your number 4 proposal.
Yes, right. Yes, good old number 4.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I got so interested in my little
it is
digression there.
Yeah.
But yes, so here's the thing. All the suggestions at the end are about things that might make polarization a little bit more manageable. So I say that as long as we could elect people in a different way, if we could use these multi-member districts or at-large election, then it would be worth expanding the size of the House of Representatives, because I think that if we did it that way, and in other words, they weren't being elected from single-member districts that could be so aggressively gerrymandered, it might bring more moderates into the House. None of these things are silver bullets, folks. I mean, this is a big problem, and that's been a long time in the making, and nothing's going to fix it in 5 years. But I do think that if we had a larger House of Representatives and they were elected in a different way, we might get more moderate members. And also, just to emphasize Jeff's point in his question, yeah, they're too big. They represent 750,000 people now. That's too much. That's not what the founders wanted. That's not what, Montesquieu was the great intellectual leader on this, and of course they all read Montesquieu, that a republic should be contained in small units and so forth. I'm sure he would have thought that the United States was, an insane idea at the size it is today, but at the very least, districts ought to be smaller. If you look at countries that elect their representatives like we elect ours, in the UK, an MP represents about 160,000 people. In France, a member of the Assembly represents about 120,000 people. We couldn't go that small, but I don't know. They should be smaller than they are.
Let's put on the table some of the other reforms because they're so important. There is end partisan gerrymandering and eliminate the Senate filibuster and get rid of the Electoral College for the political reforms before we talk about civic education, okay? On a nonpartisan basis, friends. Tell us first about the Senate filibuster and then about the Electoral College and the other reforms.
Yeah. Well, the Senate filibuster, a lot of people disagree with me because, they say, well, if this side or that side gets 51, then, they'll do whatever crazy things they're inclined to do. But I say, fine, that's democracy. You know, the 51's a majority of 100 the last time I looked. Now, the Senate is a problematic body in other ways, and we can talk about that. And changing the Senate is not one of my 14 points, because I don't know that there's any way to change that. You could have a constitutional convention, or you can have an amendment. But there's even a provision in the Constitution, of course, that says the Senate cannot be changed. So, right? So you'd have to, people talk about how you could get around that. But assuming that we have the Senate that we have for the foreseeable future, I've read a lot of stuff from the founders, let me just put it that way, where they say giving the minority a negative over the majority is a disaster. It makes the minority essentially the majority. And that is exactly what happens in the Senate today. 41 people who decide to block something on a cloture vote, you all know what a cloture vote is, 41 people are the effective majority. It's not democratic. And, you know, of course, cloture votes aren't in the Constitution, and filibusters aren't in the Constitution. These things grew up as traditions over time, and filibusters weren't even used very much until the modern era, until the 1970s and 80s. And now threats of filibusters are used all the time, and debate just ends, and it's one of the big reasons that there's such gridlock in the Senate. So it does mean, what I'm saying does mean that, you know, say until this January, Donald Trump and the Republicans in the House and Senate could have passed all kinds of things that I personally might not, you know, favor. But it also means that when, you know, the other side gets in and has their majorities, they can undo them and pass their things. I think that's more democratic.
But the title of the book is A Republic, if you can keep it, and you quote Benjamin Franklin to Mrs. Powell. Mrs. Powell, what have you created, Dr. Franklin, a republic or a monarchy? Franklin, a republic. Madam, if you can keep it, suddenly that becomes not a platitude, but a central, the most urgent question of our time. But the point is, as you stress, that the founders did not create a direct democracy, but a representative republic that would slow down deliberation so we could be guided by reason rather than passion. So how would eliminating the filibuster decrease polarization, and does the filibuster arguably increase deliberation or not?
You know, it's a great question. I'm not sure really if it decreases polarization, but it increases the functionality of the republic. I mean, I do think, you know, what do I know what the founders would think? But I think if they could come and look, I think they would say, it's too broken, something bad has happened. You know, I know that, I mean, Madison and Hamilton and others were specifically against this idea of the minority having the power of an effective majority. So I think they would look at something like the rise of filibusters and cloture votes, which again, happened very rarely. Very rarely. I mean, the only things that were filibustered in the 40s and 50s were civil rights bills. They didn't do it otherwise. Now, the cloture hurdle was higher then. It was 67 votes, not 60, but it passed routinely. It was even 67 votes at the time of the Civil Rights Bill in 1964, but 67 members, a combination of Democrats and Republicans, again, because there was that overlap, voted for cloture in 1964. So I guess I would say to you, Jeff, that they wouldn't have anticipated and they wouldn't have liked this incessant demand on cloture.
And there is no doubt that the filibuster, as you say, has dramatically increased in its use since the 80s in ways that it had never been used before. Right. You have two suggestions that are dear to my heart and I know will resonate with our Constitution Center audience: increasing civic education and increasing exchanges among citizens and students of different perspectives. I'll tell you, this is your first visit, our audience knows about our transformatively exciting civic education efforts, including the interactive Constitution, which, friends, I'm delighted to share with you is going to be upgraded on September 17th, Constitution Day, so that it includes not only the top liberal and conservative scholars discussing every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree and disagree about, but videos with Supreme Court Justices Gorsuch and Kagan, the ability to explore the evolving text of each constitutional provision over time, and most excitingly, constitutional exchanges that will unite classrooms in Philadelphia with those in California or Kentucky and Michigan to discuss constitutional issues moderated by a judge. It is a thrilling platform. The College Board is going to bring it out to all 3 to 5 million AP students, and our goal, working with you, is to bring in tens of thousands of students from the Philadelphia area, including working with Dr. Haidt, who's endorsed this project, to bring in tens of thousands of Philly public high school students to experience this material and make them constitutional ambassadors so they can connect with classrooms around the country to model the kind of civic cross-partisan exchanges you're talking about. So it's very exciting stuff.
Fabulous.
I'm happy to share it with you. Why did the founders think, and why do you think, that civic education in general, and in particular education about the Constitution in particular, is so important to save the Republic?
Well, because a citizen, is as they thought, and as I think, and you think, and all of you think, a citizen is not, just some schlub who, watches TV. A citizen has to participate. Democracy needs citizens to be active participants to engage. And let's not be unrealistic. I mean, everybody's not going to be like that. But we need a critical mass of people to be like that. And today, in our world and our country, we need even more. We need to get reacquainted with each other again. I know you all know of books like Bill Bishop's The Big Sort and a lot of other social science that has shown that we're clustering more and more with like-minded people. And we're just, a lot of us don't even know people anymore who have different politics. Maybe a cousin or something, but it's gotten to a point where we're strangers to one another. So one of the ideas that I put in there that Jeff referenced was, why don't we have exchanges among public university students? You can't make private schools do anything, but maybe they'll emulate it, where students from a very blue state go spend a year in a very red state, and vice versa. People will call this, some people will call this utopian or pie in the sky or whatever. Well, maybe, but I don't know. We did something like this before. We set up a huge network of international student exchange programs in the 1940s and 50s when we felt it was important to do so, when the world was shrinking and the United Nations was formed and we felt it was important to foster cultural understanding. We set up exchange programs. Well, we need cultural understanding today between Massachusetts and Mississippi too. So let's do that. Let's try that. And this also raises another point that I'd like to make. In the sections of the book where I talk about the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and this era of consensus, the reading I did for that section made it very clear to me that that consensus, it didn't just happen. It was forged by a bunch of different groups of people. It was forged by corporate leaders. It was forged by labor leaders. It was forged by religious leaders and civic leaders and university presidents. I mean, they were a really important part of creating a civic consensus. So, university presidents, do it again today. Now, as for civic education, it's just terrible. It's not what it should be in this country. I spoke to a few experts on the topic while I was working on the book. And kids get a year or 2. I think they should get 12. I don't see any reason why. We're in a crisis. This is an emergency. This is an emergency. Everybody's forgetting, what we have here. We need 12 years of civic education. They can cut back on a little bit on something. So that's, thanks, yes.
Hear, hear. Beautifully said, absolutely. Yeah. You say it so powerfully, and the idea of the university exchanges is fresh and compelling, and I would love to talk further with you about how We can start by using these virtual exchanges to pilot it,
Yeah.
because all you have to do is sign up online,
Great.
and then maybe bring it to colleges around the country.
to-
I jumped because it was so, because I wanted to the solutions, but we should take a beat at least on what on earth happened starting in the 1960s. You say that the first fissure was over race, which led to the ideological sorting of the parties, but then included things like the sexual revolution and the fights over religion. How did we move from a world where the parties were cross-partisan to those where they were ideologically sorted?
Because these things had never been issues before, right? Harry Truman and Jack Kennedy didn't have to take a position on abortion. And then we entered a world where you had to take a position on these questions. Now, and it was inevitable, really, if you think back on it, I believe, that one party was going to be the pro-choice party and the other party was going to be the anti-abortion party. One party was going to be the party of civil rights and the other party was going to be the party of opposition to civil rights. And one party was going to be the pro-immigration party and the other party was going to be the anti-immigration party. I don't think it was possible to have a world where there was overlap there, where like the Democrats were the abortion party but not the civil rights party, right? Because there were liberal and conservative positions on all these things. It took a while over the course of the 70s. This is an interesting little sub-fact for the Republicans to become the anti-abortion party. So, interesting little anecdote from the book. When Roe v. Wade was decided, which was decided incidentally the same day that Lyndon Johnson died, so it was the second story in every paper that day. But when it was decided, of course the headlines were huge. It was thunderous. Everybody knew it was going to be thunderous and have huge, tremendous ramifications. But the New York Times sidebar story on getting people's reactions to this decision, it didn't quote anybody from Alabama. It didn't quote anybody from the Southern Baptist Convention. The people it quoted opposing Roe v. Wade were Terence Cardinal Cook, as they were called in those days. They put the cardinal in the middle, remember?
Yes.
Cardinal Cook of New York, and the woman who was the head of the Bronx Right to Life chapter, who was also, she was presumably Catholic, Italian-American last name. So it took a while for abortion, opposition to abortion, to become a Southern, evangelical Southern Baptist issue. But it did, and those splits really drove the party also. I should say also the economic tensions. The economy of this country from 1945 to 1975 worked. Not for every single person, less so obviously for black people, but prosperity was widespread, the middle class grew, people got their dishwashers and their affluent society things, and the GDP grew by 5 and 6% a year. And then in the 1970s, you have wage stagnation and inflation. And it's not so relevant to a constitutional context of discussing my book, but I think my favorite chapter is the 5th, where I talk about these economic changes that we've gone through since the 70s, and I call the chapter More Consumers Than Citizens, and that's what we've become. Not you, of course.
No.
Those we out there have become more consumers than citizens. So that's what happened, and it created a world in which this overlap just disappeared.
Louis Brandeis was determined that we be citizens and not consumers, and under his leadership, the Democratic Party denounced the curse of corporate bigness and the risks that bankers took with other people's money, and that strain of economic populism remained alive among the Democrats through Truman, if not LBJ. Are both parties now fighting over the economic populist vote, or is that battle over?
Well, Trump has elements of economic populism in his rhetoric and in his platform. The tax plan, I would not say, is terribly economically populist. You could say that his tariff negotiations with China kind of represent that. But I don't know. I mean, I believe that once Trump is gone, the Republican Party will probably revert to its more traditional position. I might be wrong about that. I mean, I've been wrong about a lot of stuff, including who was going to win the last election. I was really, really wrong. But of course, I was not alone, so there's that little source of comfort. But I kind of think that the Republicans just adopted this because Trump adopted it, whereas the Democrats, of course, are getting more economically populist.
You note elsewhere, this was in an interview at Ideas TED, that there are several rays for hope about the end of polarization. First, a major demographic shift in the US, the growth of the Latino population. Second, the crossroads of the GOP deciding after Trump whether or not to be economically populism, and the filibuster. Tell us more about that, and in particular, what that demographic shift might mean for the Democrats post-Trump.
Well, I think it has more ramifications for the Republicans. I mean, so everybody will remember the famous autopsy after the 2012 election that Reince Priebus ordered for the Republican Party, that we have to reach out more to Latinos and we have to be more accommodating on issues of immigration and race. And that went well. I mean, it actually did for a short period of time. For a year, something happened. At least, right, the Senate passed the immigration bill in 2013 with 68 voting aye, and 14 of those 68 were Republicans. That's very bipartisan for this day and age. So that was progress, but then it never got a vote in the House, and it never got a vote in the House because John Boehner knew that if he let it come up for a vote, it would pass, but it would pass with a majority of Democrats and a minority of Republicans, and if he let a bill pass that way, in violation of the Hastert rule, he'd lose his job. So it never came up for a vote. But this will come back around, and you know, you folks know as much about this stuff as I do, but you saw that, you know, Georgia was close, Stacey Abrams came close. You saw that Florida was very close in last year's gubernatorial election. You saw that Beto O'Rourke came pretty close in Texas. Eventually, close is going to produce some wins, and when the Republicans have to start competing in those states, I think they'll at least moderate on immigration. It's going to be a hard thing to do because opposition to immigration, as we're seeing on TV every night, if you watch Fox News, and I recommend that you, I recommend that you do, just like tune in, you know, even if you're on the other side, check it out for 10 or 15 minutes during Hannity or Ingram and listen to what they say. It's a lot of it is about immigration. But you know, I think they're going to see that in 12 or so years that the math is impossible.
Wonderful. These questions are so great, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank you for them. They are so substantive and smart, and there's so many of them that I'm just trying to put them into categories so I can ask a bunch of them at the same time so we can get as many on the table. So let me start with this one. Howard Schultz will be in Philadelphia this evening at the Free Library talking about his new book, and we have several questions about that. Will Howard Schultz have a substantial impact on the 2020 election? Will it ensure the re-election of Trump? What do you think about third-party candidates entering presidential races? Would it be better if they enter as Republicans or Democrats?
Better to enter as Republicans or Democrats, yes. Schultz particularly, I don't see how he can do anything except help Trump's re-election chances, because for the simple reason that if strip everything else away, the fact that he's pro-choice means that he's going to split the pro-choice vote, and the pro-life vote will stay as one. And so Trump gets 40%, and at least 40%. And you know, I don't know. He might not do it, but that is very plausible scenario as to what he might do. The thing is, if people are frustrated by, and I know many people are, and I have my own thoughts about this critique, but I'll leave those out for the time being. But if people are frustrated that the Republicans are too far right and the Democrats are too far left and nobody's representing the middle anymore, the way to fix that, if you think that's a problem, is not to run a presidential candidate. That's like the least effective way to fix that. that will do nothing. The way to fix that is to decide that you're going to undertake a long-term project of electing moderates to Congress from both parties, if that's the way you see things. But I would say especially from the Republican Party. But if you can get a critical mass of moderates into Congress, if that's your concern, then that's going to change the way they govern more than running a guy who's guaranteed to lose and who's guaranteed to just make everybody that much madder at everybody else.
We have a whole bunch of questions about...
Oh, and by the way, if I just very quickly,
Please.
I don't think he's going to run. I think he'll drop out. I think he'll see what the polls will obviously show, and I think he'll drop out after his consultants have made a few $1 million from him.
Well, since you mentioned now and in the book the need to encourage moderate Republicans to run, what could do that?
Well, I think that takes a dedicated organization that would be focused on trying to identify districts where it was possible to elect somebody who we would call moderate. Now I'm not talking about like Jacob Javits and John Hines. They're not going to be around anymore. But here's just very quickly this little story that I tell in the book and that I've told everywhere I've talked, and everybody laughs, so I hope you laugh too. Although it's not my joke, it's Barney Frank's joke. So Frank was interviewed as he was leaving Congress by New York Magazine, and the guy was asking him about, can't you all just get along and compromise? And he said, yeah, my constituents ask me this question all the time. And I look at them and I say, how much compromising with Michelle Bachmann would you have me do? And he said, and then my constituents say to that, they say, you mean they're all Michelle Bachmann? And I say, no, they're not all Michelle Bachmann. Half are Michelle Bachmann, and half are terrified of getting a primary from Michelle Bachmann. And that's funny, but it's really true. And I can tell you from other reporting that I've done around Capitol Hill, it's very true. Republicans in particular are just terrified of getting a primary from their right. And if you think about, most of these heavily gerrymandered districts down south or in the Midwest, there's 4 or 5 people who want to run against the incumbent, state senators, the rich, guy who owns the lumber yard or whatever. And they're all conservative, and they're just waiting for for the incumbent to cast one rhino vote, Republican in name only. And boom, they'll run and they'll be financed. The Club for Growth will put money behind them. That's a particular inflection point where polarization really exists. And if somebody can dislodge that, it would do a lot of good.
Excellent. I mean, not excellent for the country, but an excellent answer. Okay, here are a whole bunch of questions on polarization. Let's just put some of them on the table. First, could polarization be a factor that could lead to a totalitarian government? On the other side, rapid and hard changes are often done hastily and can be extremely damaging. Does polarization help stop that from happening? And then a practical question about how you would solve it. You discuss the end of the fairness doctrine in your book, but you do not put anything about reducing ideological polarization on your list of things to fix. Why? I think you do, in fact, have some solutions, so maybe you could share that.
Yeah, well, ideological polarization per se, I mean, you can't ask people to think differently, but you can set up incentives for politicians to behave differently, a little bit. And so this is one, the idea that I just described about trying to create an organization that could recruit and run and finance more moderate Republicans is one such idea. That changes the incentive. In other words, the incumbent is incentivized not just by fear of a primary from the right, but perhaps by fear of a primary from the center. It's like there's not that many districts where it would work, but there are a few. So my ideas tend to be focused on things like that. What can change the incentive structure that might make them cooperate a little bit more, that might make them compromise a little bit more? What did you add? Totalitarianism. Well, why would that occur to anybody? I think as many flaws as our system has, I think it has enough, God knows, enough built-in choke points. And I still think that both sides have enough respect for those choke points and those traditions that I don't worry that much about that kind of thing. And so maybe there is an extent to which the potential for dysfunction that was built into our system also does safeguard us, perhaps, against any kind of violent takeover. But I don't know. I mean, we might see in 2020. I mean, Alex Jones promises a civil war if certain things happen to the president. I don't know how much power Alex Jones has, but they have guns. I know that much. But I think that's not. I don't wake up worrying about that.
But the third question related to your last point, are the choke points a good thing? Are these the Madisonian cooling mechanisms that ensured the rule of reason over passion? And in that sense, why should we be worried about polarization?
Fair question. I mean, I had a couple of friends read sections of the book who said, well, maybe polarization isn't, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe this is how it's meant to be. There is a way in which, I say at one point in the book, I don't even want no polarization. Not that that's possible. It's not possible. We should have some polarization. We should have ideologically coherent parties. FDR wanted that, by the way, which did not exist in his time. And after he beat Wendell Willkie, he approached Willkie and said, Wendell, what we should really have is a liberal party in this country and a conservative party. Why don't you and I form the Liberal Party and rejigger all this, and then my Southerners can go up and join the Conservative Party, and then that way I can pass things, because he was always being stymied by the conservative wing of the Democratic Party. But, he had a war to fight. It took up a lot of his time, and then he got sick, and so it never happened. But yes, some polarization is desirable and necessary because we disagree about real things, and we should fight this out. We should have these fights about real things. But there's an extent to which, and this is going to be in the eye of the beholder, I guess, but there's an extent to which the choke points do make it worse. And I think the filibuster, the use of the clotures, which we discussed, is one of those choke points, for example.
And the choke points, you argue, are not supposed to lead to heart attacks. They're supposed to allow for reasoned compromise within the realms of possible agreement.
Yes.
A bunch of great historical questions. My College American Government book said the U.S. political parties operated nationally only once every 4 years, presidential elections. So you had states with conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. What happened since the national party organizations still don't run things?
Yeah, well, I think what that means is that, like in the 19th century, they didn't really have, Van Buren set up a national structure, but I guess that was something of an aberration. So if you look, say, for example, at the late 19th century Democratic Party, it was really two entities. It was the Southern racist, apartheid party, and then it was the Northern machine party. It was the party of Boss Tweed. And the Southern wing of the party didn't have any national program. Their program was Jim Crow, and that was it, basically. And the Northerners, they cared about paving contracts. They didn't have any particular national policy. They got together every 4 years to nominate a candidate for president. Because New York was so much bigger than every other state in those days, they tended to be from New York. And Grover Cleveland, in fact, who was from New York, was the only Democrat who won in that time. The rest was all Republicans, because the Republicans had a little bit more coherence, and they had more money, being the party of Wall Street. I think today we have very national parties, wouldn't you say? I think that, if you go from the Upper West Side to West, Hollywood, to Evanston, Illinois, to certain neighborhoods in Norman, Oklahoma, you're not going to find people that disagree very much, right? Norman's a university town, and I mean where the professors live, you know. Right? The people are going to think largely the same. You know, they may have slightly different points of emphasis about how they feel about transgender bathrooms or something, but like they're basically going to agree on stuff. And conversely, if you go from a small town, 50 miles west of here, to a small town in southern West Virginia, to a small town in the bluest state, to a small town in the middle of Vermont, you'll find, I think, a lot of, okay, maybe not Vermont, that might be stretching it, but certainly New Hampshire, Maine, you know, any kind of very blue state. The rural areas, people will feel like people down in Alabama do. So that suggests a very national, ideologically coherent identity to me.
Wonderful. There's so many more questions, but the one rule of these great convenings is that they have to end on time, so this is an opportunity for some closing thoughts, and here it is. Given the difficulty of passing many of your suggestions for reform, some of which would require constitutional amendments, are there one or two of your ideas to enhance the ability to collaborate in Congress that would be easier to pass than others?
Well, I would just return, I guess, to my revived moderate republicanism idea. It doesn't require anybody to pass anything. It just requires people like Howard Schultz and Michael Bloomberg and other people like that to put money into a program where they identify 20 Republican-held congressional districts where maybe they can elect people who would actually come to Congress, and instead of never voting for a compromise measure or a Democratic budget, if there's a Democratic president, who would do so, and then, crucially, survive re-election, right? Because that has to happen. And that's a big thing. Like, I write a lot in the book about Grover Norquist and his tax pledge. And it's a very important source of polarization. We didn't get to it here today, fine, but you can read about it in chapter 6. But someday, it'll take for some Republicans to compromise, agree that a Democratic president should get a tax increase of some kind, and then they have to survive re-election. And then the smoke can clear a little bit, and there can be a little bit more cooperation. And it doesn't take many people. You know, if you have 435 people, 15 is a voting block. 15 is a real block. You know, if you have, 15 Republicans voting with 220 Democrats to pass something, that's bipartisan by today's standards, or the opposite too. 220 Republicans and 15 Democrats. That's bipartisan by today's standards. And so that's a starting place. Get some more moderates of both parties, but I think the Republicans have gone off farther than the Democrats have, in my personal view. So it's a more important thing for the Republican Party, but for both parties. If you can find ways to elect more people who are from the center. And by the way, the Democrats did that this time. I mean, AOC and is the only one who gets a ton of press. So you'd think that the Democrats have formed like Das Kapital reading groups. But they actually elected more people who joined the New Democratic Caucus and the Blue Dog Caucus than joined the Progressive Caucus. Because they elect people from these purple districts, who like Connor Lamb in Western Pennsylvania. There are a lot of Connor Lambs. We need some Republican Connor Lambs.
Ladies and gentlemen, please meet Michael Tomasky outside and thank him for casting light on American politics.
Thanks.
Superb.